Welcome, my friends, to the Sage of Quay Radio Hour, your home for free and critical thinking, and I'm your host, Mike Williams. Tonight, my very special guest and friend is Walt Schnabel. Walt recently had the opportunity to speak with Denny Laine, where he asked Denny about his days with Beatle Bill. Denny's response to Walt was very interesting and, dare we say, revealing. And so, without further ado, here's the conversation with Walt. Well, folks, we have a very interesting show. My friend Walt Schnabel contacted me a couple of days ago. And as many of you know that follow my work, that I am heavily into the McCartney conspiracy. And Walt had the opportunity to speak with Denny Laine. And Walt, I'm not sure how you had that opportunity or what the circumstances were, so I'm going to be very interested in hearing how that developed. And I also want to say thank you so much for contacting me to talk about this. Walt interviewed me actually last year, and as I mentioned to you, Walt, in one of the comments on Facebook, that show still gets a lot of views, and I get a lot of feedback because as far as I was concerned, it was one of the better shows that I've done where I was the guest talking about the McCartney conspiracy. So thank you for that.
Yeah, well, it's great to hear. I'm glad that people are still listening to it and it's still kind of resonating with people.
Still resonating with them.
It's good to know. Good to know.
So, Walt, what was the conversation with Denny Laine? And maybe we should start with, how did you actually get the opportunity to speak to him?
Well, it was interesting. I volunteer at a music venue, and the way it works is the guy that is in charge of the volunteers sends out a list of the shows, the upcoming shows for the next month, and you put in for it, and you either get picked or you don't, depending usually on how quickly you put in for it. So I saw Denny Laine and the Moody Wings Band, which is kind of a play on, his past history, right, which we can get to in a little bit. So I put in for it, and I get an email back from the guy saying that I got the show, so great. So in the interim, you posted I guess that's your most recent expo on the Paul's Dead thing. It was done in December.
Yeah, the one where it was the Beatles, McCartney, and the Grand Illusion, the PowerPoint presentation,
yes.
That one?
That's the one,
yeah.
Right. So I watched it, and it was great. I mean, for my money, it's the definitive piece of work on that topic up to this point, anyway. And the reason why I say that is it's really about more than the Paul's Dead thing. It's really more about how our illusions are being created by some group of people, perhaps, that want us to not know the truth or want the truth to be masked in a series of, I call them delusions, really. So that's why I felt that was a very, very serious and well thought out piece of work. And a lot of stuff you see on YouTube and stuff is okay, but it's not really well thought out or even well researched. And you did all of that. So to me it was, and I posted that on my Facebook page, and I did get some reactions from people on it, very positive ones.
Well, thank you, Walt.
You deserve it, Mike. You put a lot of work into that. So I got to thinking that, here I'm going to see Denny Laine, and you, in your PowerPoint presentation, you brought out a video of him being interviewed. I don't know how far back that was, maybe a few years ago anyway.
It was about a year or two, yeah.
Yeah. And we had talked about that in our previous conversation when we interviewed you. And he was being interviewed by a guy from a rock venue of some kind of rock magazine, and they were drinking pretty heavily. And so, sometimes people tend to say things when they're drinking that they may not necessarily say otherwise. So at the very end of the interview, he kind of brought in the whole idea of Billy Shears to Denny. And Denny kind of laughed a little bit and hesitated. But he really did kind of come clean on it too. And he admitted that, there was something to the whole Billy Shears. I don't know if you want to elaborate on that a little bit more, but.
Well, what he did in that interview was, and this is what I point out in the presentation, Walt, is that he never mentions the name Paul McCartney. So when he's asked about what it was like to play with Billy Shepherd, he never says, what do you mean Billy Shepherd? He says Billy Shears.
Mm-hmm.
He never says, what are you talking about? I played with Paul McCartney. Paul McCartney's the guy that I played with in Wings, right? So he never, ever says that. And this is something that goes over a lot of people's heads, because the way this works is they know that people will fill in the blanks. They know that people will assume that it's just Paul McCartney. And this is why I spent a lot of time over the last few months getting people educated on what the Masons refer to as masterfully speaking.
Right.
When they masterfully speak, they can disclose an enormous amount of truth, but they have to do it in a disguised way.
Mm-hmm.
And that's exactly what Denny was doing. Even though he had, a number of drinks under his belt, he still kept the masterfully speaking technique under control. And at the very end of that interview, it was very interesting. He says, well, who the hell is Billy Campbell anyway?
Mm.
Right. So there was a lot of things going on there. But
Absolutely.
The most important piece of that dialogue is he never says, I played with Paul McCartney. He never mentions McCartney's name. And that's what everybody needs to take in when they watch that clip. So
given that, that piece in your expo, I got to thinking, well, sometimes when you're a volunteer, you have to get there early to set up and make sure everything's the way it should be and go over the lists and all that stuff. So generally I get there about an hour and a half before the show. And most times the group is doing a sound check at that point. Now on Tuesday night when the show was, I got there a little late because we had an ice storm. So the sound check was already done. And that's generally one of the times when, as a volunteer, you can sometimes interact with the musicians. So I kind of blew that part of it. I was thinking maybe sometimes they'll walk around after they do the sound check and just chat with people, So I thought that might have been one of the opportunities where I could get to kind of interact with him a little bit. So anyway, I missed out on that. So I'm thinking, well, I don't know how this is going to work out. So he comes out and does the show, and he at this point he looks kind of like like your old Uncle Joe from Thanksgiving. He's got dyed hair and he doesn't present very well anymore. At some point he was a rock star, pretty much. So, but when he gets up on the stage and picks his guitar up, there's like a magic happens. He's just an incredible performer. I mean, he's still got a pretty good voice. Maybe not quite as good as, when he was in his 20s, but he can still sing a song, and he did a lot of his material. He did, and a couple of things I didn't even realize. He did the song Go Now. Yeah. Now, backtracking a little bit to his past in the English music scene. He's got a boatload of credentials, under his belt. And I'm sure you know all this, but, he was the original founder of the Moody Blues. I think he was with them for a couple of their albums. And on stage, he said, I was in the Moody Blues. I started the Moody Blues, but I wasn't there for the Knights in White Satin stage. He says, I could sing that if I wanted to, but I don't want to. So he's a really jovial, he's got a very polished stage presence, and he just had the audience in the palm of his hand. And he's still a really good guitar player. I don't know if you're a guitar player, so you can probably judge his playing a little more critically.
But Denny's very talented.
Yeah, he is. He really is. And I didn't know this. I really only knew him in terms of the fact that he played with Wings. I didn't know too much about his past, musicology, I guess. And truthfully, I was never a huge fan of Wings. I don't know why. They just never really did it for me. I thought they were very poppy and a lot of people loved them, and more power to them. So, but Denny had a big role in that band. He was one of the main players. So he went through his whole kind of progression of music. And another thing I didn't realize that he was very blues based. He talked about meeting Sonny Boy Williamson, an old blues player in Paris, and he taught him how to play the harmonica on different songs. And he really did a very retrospective of his career, on stage, and it was great. It was a really wonderful show, and the people loved it. He just had everybody in the palm of his hand. So the show's over, and he played about 2 hours, which is, with no break, which is, pretty good for, he's like 75 now, around in that area. So, yep. He's probably, it's probably a lot of energy for him to put out to do a 2-hour show, and a lot of energy put out, not just going through the motions kind of thing. He really did a lot. So the show's over, and he's still pretty popular. So there was maybe 10 or 12 people kind of hanging around, sort of waiting to see if he was going to come out, because it's a very small venue. And after the show, a lot of times, like the drummer came out and got a beer, and the bass player came out and people were talking to him. And so the manager of the place was talking to some of the people that were waiting there. And he says he had talked to Denny backstage, and he's not coming out. He's just too tired, and he doesn't want to sign autographs. And so I thought, oh, well, that's kind of shitty, but it's the way it is. He's a big star,
And he's 75 years old.
And he's 75, right.
Yeah.
So, so I can understand. Yeah. I can understand. So, I'm starting to think now that this is not looking too good. I may not get to interact with him. So I was a little disappointed, but one thing about being a volunteer is you can kind of hang out after everybody leaves, and, you have to kind of get the chairs straightened out and pick cans of bottles up and that, kind of get the place ready for the next show. So I was hanging out with another lady who was a volunteer, and she was a big Wings fan, and she was kind of hoping to get a glimpse of Denny, and this kind of thing. So we were talking about shows she had seen and stuff like that. And now pretty much all the people who were hanging around waiting to see him have, faded off. There's only a few people left. So he kind of comes ambling out of the dressing room, and he's putting his guitar, messing with his guitars and his equipment and stuff. So I said, hey, Denny, great show, And I was maybe, 20 feet away from him. The two of us were standing there. And so he came walking over, and he said, oh, that's nice to hear. And he's really a very affable guy. It kind of came across on the video clip that you had when he was being interviewed.
Yeah.
Granted, he had a few drinks, but he was very friendly. He was very, very affable. And he's like, oh, I'm glad you liked the show. And I said, I understand this is the first night of your tour. And he said, yeah. He said, I played with these guys, and he had some younger guys playing with him, but they're all really good musicians. And he had a tight band for, being the first stop on the tour. And he said, oh, well, glad to hear that, and he was really very, very approachable and friendly. And so the conversation, and she started talking about seeing him in the 78 tour, Wings Across America. And he liked hearing all that stuff. So the conversation was kind of winding down. And so I said, Denny, have you seen Bill the Beatle lately? And he stopped, kind of stopped in his tracks, like he was kind of stunned. And he looked at me kind of crosswise, and he said, well, what are you talking about? In that heavy English accent. What are you talking about? And I said, Bill the Beatle. And he said, I don't know what you're talking about. But you could kind of tell that he did. He's kind of like, he had that affect, like, yeah, I know what you're talking about, but I'm not going to go there kind of thing.
Yeah.
How people do. So he looked at the lady standing next to me. He said, what's he talking about? I don't know what he's talking about. And he was kind of joking, like, you know what I mean? And I wanted to keep it sort of light. I didn't want to accost him with this. You know what I mean? I wanted to keep it sort of like we were joking about it, and he was okay with that. So I said, come on, Danny, you know what I'm talking about. You know who Bill the Beatle is. And he said, no. He said, oh, he said, is that and this, I missed the name that he said. I wish I had heard it more clearly. He said, are you talking about the tall left-handed bass player named Bill somebody? It wasn't Shepard. It wasn't Shepard or Shears, or it was some name. I'm quite sure that's who he was talking about. I mean, think about it. Bill Shepard's taller than the original Paul. Left-handed bass player. And he kind of laughed. It was still on a kind of a lighthearted mode, and he said, I don't know what you're talking about, mate, and he kind of started walking away, and he was kind of fumbling with his stuff again. And so I said, come on, Danny, you know what I'm talking about, Bill Shepard, Billy Campbell. And he looked up. It was a very almost surreal moment, because I could see he was thinking, and he was probably trying to figure out what to say or how to say it. And, when you think about it, this is Denny Laine, he didn't have to even answer me. He didn't have to say, he could have just said, forget you, because I'm just a volunteer at the place, So he looks up and he says, oh, you mean Bill McCartney? He said, no, I haven't seen him for quite a while.
There you go.
And, correct me if I'm wrong, because you're the master of this, but, I think that was masterful talk that he was doing. And what's your spin on that?
Well, I think you caught him a little off guard, which was good.
Yeah, I think so too.
So what happened was, he wasn't able to play through his mind in advance how he was going to address any questions that would come up that way because he wasn't expecting that question to come up. And so when you presented it and then you pushed it a little bit, Denny had to go into, okay, how do I respond to this? But again, Walt, as you're telling this story, he never says Paul McCartney.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not.
So this is the thing. It doesn't mention him because he never played with biological Paul McCartney. He's only played with Bill. Mm-hmm. And he played with Bill back in the days of the Diplomats.
Right.
Then, his Wings career. So that was, in my view, another example of masterfully speaking. He probably stumbled a little bit with it because he was caught off guard. But again, not to sound like a broken record, but the takeaway here is that Denny never says, what are you talking about? All this Beatle Bill nonsense and Billy Shepherd and Billy Campbell or Billy Shears. I mean, I don't know what you guys are talking about. I played with Paul McCartney. You guys just need to stop with this.
Never said that.
Right. That would be the natural response from somebody if they were asked questions about something that was just crazy. They would just say, just stop it, shut it down, stop asking me these questions. This stuff is all nonsense. That is never said.
That's kind of the approach he took when I first said it. He looked at me like, well, what are you talking about? Yeah. But I think he knew exactly what I was. Now, Bill the Beatle is, from what I understand, is what George Harrison and I think maybe Lennon referred to Bill Shepherd.
Yeah.
That's how they referred to him. There's a clip of a dinner party which I think was at John's house. And George was sitting there and he said, oh, when's Bill the Beatle coming? And Lennon repeated it or something. And so that must be how that was their little sort of joke between them, I guess, maybe.
Yeah, that was his, that's what they called him, Beatle Bill. And in that clip, there's a truer version of that clip. They actually mentioned Beatle Bill and Beatle Ed.
Yeah, what was Beatle Ed?
Nobody knows. I mean, I'm not saying nobody knows. Obviously, somebody knows. I don't know who Beatle Ed is.
Oh, okay. So you don't even know.
I don't know who that is. I have hypothesized that perhaps in my last presentation, the Beatles, Paul McCartney, and the Grand Illusion, that maybe Beatle Ed could be a reference to Street Paul. Maybe.
Apparently, we're more than one Pauls or fake.
Yeah, they were. I have presented a theory that there were two permanent replacements. That doesn't mean that others did not play the role over time. The premise is that my premise, two permanent replacements. One was an actor who was not a musician. That would be the public persona.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was Billy Shepherd, whose surgeries lagged behind that of Street Paul. But it didn't matter because Billy's role was to write and record music, right? So he would be within the confines of a recording studio,
right.
Within the company of those people that knew the story. So, no big deal.
Mm-hmm.
And while he was recording and writing songs as a Beatle, we had Street Paul playing the part, acting on the outside for public consumption.
Right. And I don't know if you know much about this, but apparently Denny was being considered for the role of
the replacement.
The replacement for Paul. Had you ever heard that? And that may be conjecture. I don't know, or if there's any truth to it at all, I don't know.
There are theories out there that he actually was one of the others that played the role here and there. In other words, he would page in and page out. So it wasn't a permanent engagement.
Like a substitute kind of, yeah.
Yeah, he would substitute in. It's like there's a theory out there that Spencer Davis did the same thing. That some of the Pauls that we see over time are actually Spencer Davis done up to look like Paul with makeup and all that stuff. And that's why it became very difficult for Paul is Dead researchers to take a look at photographs or images on the internet and to discern who was who.
Right. There's a lot of different permutations of it.
Yeah. My theory of a street Paul and a musician Paul, well, right there we have two versions. They are not exact replicas. They have resemblances to biological Paul, but, there are differences. So you had those two out there, plus you had other actors, filling in and paging in and out. Perhaps it was Denny, perhaps it was Spencer Davis. And, they're being photographed and images are being altered. And, back in the day, I don't think we had Photoshop back in the 60s and 70s.
No.
But there were ways that the controllers had ways of doctoring photos. And so they were doing a lot of doctoring and altering. And by the time we got to the Internet, as we know it in 1990, the people behind the conspiracy, Tavistock and company, they had 25 to 30 years of contaminating the waters, And so by the time we all caught up with taking a look at different photos and images on the Internet and trying to figure out which side is up, it became a very, very difficult process to do that.
Yeah.
And that was intentionally done. That was intentionally done in order to create the confusion.
Oddly enough, though, having seen him close up, and I said, he's an old man now, but he does kind of resemble Paul a little bit, facially. The replacement Paul, not the biological Paul, the Bill. And if you look at the current photos of what people think is Paul McCartney, he does sort of resemble the face structure. And even when they were younger, if you look at the pictures way back, they do kind of resemble each other. So I can kind of see that. But the thing I really wanted to remark about is that during the period of time where he was kind of contemplating what to say, and this is just my interpretation or my intuitive view maybe, he did look like he wanted to say something. He didn't want to just blow me off and just say, hit the road or whatever. So I wondered, is there something that he feels like he's trying to get this off his chest? Is there sort of a guilt factor, or, that he's been part of this? And he really has been kind of he's got to have known this whole illusion since almost the beginning. I think he actually knew biological Paul at some point, because they, in the early 60s, those guys kind of all knew each other.
Absolutely.
Before the Beatles were the Beatles, they played together and hung out, and, he's gone on tape and said that they had big parties at some mansion, and the Beatles, Harrison would come and McCartney would come. And
right.
So he has to have known about this whole thing right on down the line. And then he got picked to be in Wings, because I think he had a connection to Bill.
He had a connection to Bill going back to the Diplomats. So
right.
There was a character in the Diplomats called Phil Ackrell.
Well, I wanted to ask you about that, where that comes in. What's the story behind that?
Okay, so in the memoirs of Billy Shears, Bill, who's clearly behind the book, and I can get into that a little bit too, because sometimes we've got people out there saying it's complete disinformation and it's fiction, but it's not.
Right.
But in the book, he says that he has played various characters over time, one of them being Phil Ackrell in the Diplomats. When he was playing the role of Phil Ackrell in the Diplomats, Denny Laine was in the band. So it was Phil Ackrell and Denny Laine. They actually recorded a complete album, which is locked away. In memoirs, Bill says that perhaps someday they will release the album, but that album has basically been put on a shelf for obvious reasons, right? Because then you're going to start to make voice comparisons and all that stuff, and we're going to start to close in on validating that Bill is playing the part of Paul McCartney. But in any case, so what Bill did, he had Denny in the band, or Denny had him in the band back during the days of the Diplomats.
This is like early 60s.
Early 60s, 1960, 61, 62, very early 1960s. They were very young guys. Bill at that time was 23 years old in 1960, so they were just, young guys. And so when Billy formed Wings, all he did was he just, tapped his old friend Denny Laine to come back and help him fire up this band. That's what Bill did, right? So Bill reached back into his past. Denny's always been a good friend of his, and said, hey, look, the Beatle thing is over. I want to form a new band. I'm starting from scratch. Will you join me? And so Denny said, yeah, sure. Let's do it. Let's just like the old days. Let's do it again,
Mm-hmm.
But I do want to explain the Ackrell thing, because there are folks that are listening to this right now that will be screaming and yelling at the monitor into the speakers saying that No, Phil Ackrell. We have a video of Phil Ackrell in the 1980s and the 1990s, and Billy Shepherd didn't play Phil Ackrell. This is all nonsense. What folks have to understand is this is the model, the template that they use. They had various people page in and step in and play the roles over time. So the character of Phil Ackrell with the Diplomats was Bill Shepherd. When Billy had to leave because he was doing other work, then what would happen is they would bring in somebody else that would play the role of Phil Ackrell. And this person would have a similar look, like maybe a double, a look-alike, and stuff like that. And honestly, the Diplomats were not big enough for anybody to really notice if somebody got swapped out. That's the other thing that everybody has to remember, right? Mm-hmm. We only really know about the Diplomats today, those of us that are following the Paul is Dead conspiracy, because we've tied the Diplomats in to the McCartney conspiracy because we're saying that Shepherd played the part of Ackrell in the band, right? And has ties to Denny Laine. So when people show me videos of Phil Ackrell, allegedly Phil Ackrell playing in a band, small venues, very small venues in the 1980s or the 1990s, what they're seeing is another actor/musician playing that role, playing that part. That's what you're seeing. Mm-hmm. And, it's the same thing as, similar to the whole premise I brought forth, the theory of street Paul versus musician Paul, right? Yeah. And then we find in the updated version of the Memoirs of Billy Shears, Walt, the blue cover. The old version was the red cover. Mm-hmm. You notice we have red and blue. I mean,
yeah, we talked about that in the previous show. Yeah, yeah, exactly. Right? Yeah.
Red Lodge, Blue Lodge.
Yeah, it all has meaning. It's all symbolic.
It's all symbolic, and it's all tied out. Nothing is by chance. Everything is thought out. It's all been strategized and put into play. But then when we read the new version of the Memoirs of Billy Shears, a lot of people argue with me that Billy did not play Vivian Stanshall, because if you look at videos of Vivian Stanshall on YouTube, when he's not with the Bonzo Dog Band, they say, well, that doesn't look like him at all. Well, I think it's page 84 of the revised version of Memoirs. Bill explains in a footnote. Actually, Tom does the footnote, but of course, all this information is coming from Bill. Right. Bill has to sanction what goes into the book. It says that there was a lifetime actor playing Stanshall for the purposes of public consumption, and there was the Vivian Stanshall that was performing with the Bonzo Dog Band with Neil Innes and Company. That version with the Bonzo Dog Band was Bill Shepherd. The other version that people are looking at that made TV appearances or doing some acting and dabbling, he was a musician also, but he would dabble with his instrument a little bit and so on. And if you look at the two Stanshalls, if you take a look at the Vivian Stanshall that was in the Bonzo Dog Band with Neil Innes, and then you take a look at the Stanshall that was, kind of the quirky character in some of these other videos.
Yeah, he was kind of weird looking. He had big glasses and kind of long, kind of freakish looking hair, and almost like he had a wig on or something. It's very strange looking.
A lot of latex was used and stuff like that. What you're looking at is if you compare the Stanshall in the Bonzo Dog Band and then you compare the other Stanshall, you should take a step back. They are not the same person. They are not the same person. And the reason why they're not the same person is because Billy put in place a lifetime actor to play the part of Vivian Stanshall. This person took on the Stanshall character which Bill created, and this person lived their life that way. This is the same person, that version of Stanshall, the street version, who married Quay Longfellow and had children. And this is the one that died in the fire back in 1995 at the age of 51. But he's not Vivian Stanshall. Vivian Stanshall is fiction. He's a character. So we don't know the name of the lifetime actor, or at least I don't know the name of that person, but he played that role. And what happened was Bill wanted to retire the role altogether. I guess they were going to have a fictitious death and all this stuff. And according to Memoirs, he was going to have this actor, this lifetime actor, taken care of for the rest of his life. In other words, he'd receive some kind of payment or pension, whatever it may be, to just to retire the character. And
Hush money, maybe.
yeah, I guess hush money. But what happened was, according to the book, this actor said, no way. I'm not going to do this because I have made a career out of this. This is who I am today. I'm playing this character, Vivian Stanshall. This has become my life. This has become my identity. And he refused to do it. Bill felt, I guess he thought, well, if I give this guy a ton of money, he's just going to make a very simple decision and say,
Right.
I'm not going to do this anymore. But the guy pushed back. And then what happened was he died in a fire. I don't want to read into that.
Really?
Dying fires.
Yeah, well, I know.
Right?
Of maybe a mysterious origin.
Yeah, that's the Stanshall that was married, had 2 children, and died.
So it's all kind of muddled up. That's kind of by intention. It seems like it's by intention.
The template is the same, though, Walt, right? So the template they're using is that they have actors and people playing roles, paging in and out. Some of them are lifetime actors, like in the case of the person that was playing Vivian Stanshall for public consumption. Other times they are actors just playing a role for a particular moment in time. So in the new memoirs, he even says that there was a version of Paul, a person playing the role, but also who was a musician who did some recording. It's a little ambiguous, but I'm reading between the lines, and I think what Bill is telling us is that on a Beatle album, so maybe there's a couple of songs that the Beatles did where the version of Paul McCartney was not Bill Shepherd. It was another person playing the role of Paul McCartney, at least in the studio, right? Mm-hmm. That was recorded and wound up as an album track on a Beatle album. This whole McCartney thing, right? It's more than just a musician that was swapped out. It's far more than that.
It goes much deeper, and it's
much deeper.
Much more. It speaks much more toward how our reality is being manipulated. I think this is a piece of that whole picture. I think,
exactly.
And that's the real important takeaway from the whole thing. I think is that what's like John said, nothing is real.
Right. Living is easy
strawberry
with eyes
fields
closed.
forever. Yeah. So getting back to Denny's reaction, that when I talked to him, I really did have the feeling that it was, and this is probably reading into it quite a bit, but that it was almost confessional in some sense, like he felt like he had to say something, like it was sort of obligatory, and maybe that's part of the whole Masonic piece, the whole, that you can't just not say something, so you say something that kind of creates an ambiguous sort of response. And that's what it's. Why do you think he chose Bill McCartney? That's an interesting choice, I think, because he was answering, but he wasn't answering. You know what I mean? In some sense.
Yeah, he was saying that because he's giving you the clue.
Yeah.
He's telling. Well, we know there is no Bill McCartney. Who the heck is Bill McCartney? It's Paul McCartney.
Yeah.
So by inserting the name Bill as the first name and then saying McCartney, what he's telling you and what he's telling us is that the guy that I played with was not biological Paul McCartney.
Right. That's the way I got.
Without a question of a doubt. And to answer your question, Walt, because it's a good question, he seems like he wants to get something out. Well, Billy wants to get it out also. Otherwise, the memoirs of Billy Shears would never have been published, right? And the reason why Billy wants to disclose is because for over 50 years, nobody knows who Bill is. Everybody thinks that the guy that's written all these songs from Sgt. Pepper on, all through his solo career, is Paul McCartney. No, it's not Paul McCartney. It's Billy Shepherd. It's Billy Shears. Or if you want to argue the last name, Billy Campbell. I don't care about the last name, by the way.
Yeah, it's all the same person.
It's all the same person, right? So we have these aliases or whatever. It doesn't really matter. So Billy's at a point now where his runway is getting short. He's 81 years old. So I guess as part of his agreement, whatever agreement he reached is allowing him to be able to go through the disclosure process now. And so he's doing that. And unfortunately for people like Denny, who have had to sit on this thing for a very long time, because Denny's in the club too, right?
Oh yeah, there's a picture I ran, not to interrupt you, but there's a picture I ran across of replacement Paul and Linda. This is probably from the Wings days, and Denny they were just doing a publicity photo, and Denny was doing the Illuminati, the horns, Illuminati sign. And she was too. Yeah. She was doing the V sign, and McCartney was doing something else too, but they were all doing sort of an Illuminati sign. So you know that he's part of the whole thing.
Yeah, he's in the club. But the problem that Denny has now, and for others who are associated with Bill, is that more and more people are understanding this conspiracy. And they're understanding that there was a deception involved. And more people, or let's just say this, the odds are increasing that any time that Denny runs into people or opens up the possibility of having a discussion with him, that they're going to ask him this question. So there's more and more pressure put on the likes of Denny Laine and others who have participated in the conspiracy to have to figure out more ingenious ways to be able to respond to questions like the question you asked. And he says, well, Bill McCartney, right? So, and this is all being driven by the fact that Bill himself has decided he's going to disclose.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so there's a domino effect, right? So Bill, being the main guy, has decided, I'm going to disclose, the time is now. And so everybody else who's attached to him has now got the additional or the added pressure of having to be in step with him as to how much they can disclose, how much they can say. In the past, most people blew the conspiracy off. They just said, it's a bunch of bullshit, right? This is just ridiculous. And so they were able to leverage that angle of it. But as more and more people now are realizing that this conspiracy is real, it's putting them on the spot. It's putting Denny Laine on the spot. And like I said, you caught him off guard because here he is. He's putting his guitars away and, he's getting himself all, packed up.
It wasn't an interview per se.
It wasn't an interview.
Right. It wasn't like a setup interview and he does a lot of those, I know, but, so I did I did surprise him. But the weird thing is, I kind of half expected him to be angry and say, just get away from me. And I had told you that I was joking about that he might have me thrown out, like if I had talked to him before the show,
right.
And that probably wouldn't happen, but I half expected him to say, just get away from me. Why are you asking me that or something? But he didn't. And he was really almost kind of affable about it. It was like he was joking about it, and I kept it in that vein too. I said at one point, oh, Danny, I'm just teasing you, just to keep it lighthearted, and he kind of smiled and laughed, and he, at no point during the whole interaction was he angry or, surly or anything like that. He was just, like he was just, like he was talking to one of his buddies, or something, So I thought that a little curious. I just thought that was a little curious, but I do think there's an element of, he's carried this around for a long time,
right.
And you think about that, carrying some secret around with you. And that's the first thing you do when you get into some kind of psychoanalysis is you try to get all the crap off your chest that you've been, all the baggage you've been carrying around with you your whole life, and maybe that's part of what he's doing. I don't know. And maybe part of it is that, they're moving toward that. They're moving toward disclosure or whatever you want to call it, or, and maybe he's part of that whole process too. I don't know. What's your feeling? I just got that. It was almost like I said, it was like a surreal moment, where it was, how you have sort of like almost like an out of body experience sometimes. And it was almost like we connected on another level or something, and he kind of felt like he had to say something to me about it, and I never met him before and he didn't know who the hell I was. So it was kind of a surreal experience, like an out of body experience sort of thing. It was just very strange, very strange.
Well, there's a couple of things going on. Number one is, he's obviously very well aware that the disclosure is underway, and it is underway. The Memoirs of Billy Shears is Bill telling us his life story, and he's telling us in a masterfully disclosed way how this thing happened. And Denny knows that disclosure is happening. And so he's playing a part in it. He has to participate in it. And Denny just needs to make sure, and he knows this, right? He's a high-level Freemason, that he stays in lockstep with the rate and pace of the disclosure. He can't get ahead of it, is what I'm saying, right?
Right.
He can't be the one that's going to spill the beans. He's got to stay in lockstep. And the other piece of it is, you're absolutely correct, in my opinion, that this is a heavy load to carry, right? Even though you're sworn to secrecy and all this stuff, and this is the way it works and all that, you still know that there was a monstrosity of a deception that took place. And you're carrying that with you. And so there is that part of you that says, I just want to offload this thing. I want to get this thing off my chest. I don't want to keep carrying this around. The other piece of it is that in my last presentation, I was told by a high-level Freemason that the way the Freemasons look at the population is that there are two classes of people. There are those people with the key for knowledge, and there are those that do not possess that key, right?
Right.
So when a Mason is interacting with somebody that they detect possesses that key, they will have a higher level conversation with that person.
Mm-hmm.
You possess that key. So when you had the discussion with Denny, Denny had to tailor the conversation with you in a way that he can disclose information to you, give you a little bit more of the pieces to the puzzle than he would have given somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So as an example, if you had said to him, hey, what was it like to play with Paul McCartney? He would look at that person asking that question as somebody that perhaps does not possess that key. And so they will get a response that is appropriate for somebody that is not knowing. So they notch it down. You're going to get the profane answer is what's going to happen.
Yeah.
But when you asked him, he knew that you knew. You see? And so he had to raise the bar on his response to you without openly saying,
Paul's
the gig is up, you're right, right?
Right.
But in a way he did that. And it's funny how Denny's doing this, because the interview going back a year or two ago that I have in my presentation, he's clearly telling us there, anybody who's thinking through this will realize what Denny's telling us. And then this conversation with you. Mm-hmm. And the beautiful part about your conversation with him is he wasn't expecting it.
No, it was off the cuff. Yeah, it was definitely off the cuff. It was. Another piece of this, and I don't know whether we talked about this in the previous interview we did or not, but my father was a Mason. Not a real high-level Mason, but one time when I was a kid, maybe, 11, 12 years old, something like that, we were sitting in a diner and, just having a hamburger or something, and this guy came along, and my father said to him, and I can still remember this distinctly to this day, my father said to him, have you done any traveling lately? Which is a kind of an odd thing to say. So the guy responded in some way, and I absorbed that conversation. I don't know how or why, but after the guy left, I said to my father, was that some kind of a code or something that you used? And my father sort of got flustered. My father didn't fluster easily. And he said, well, don't ever say that to don't say that to anybody. That's that's a secret thing. And, it had to do with him being a Mason, and so maybe on some level I absorbed that, and that came through, on some level to Denny when I don't know. It's a little bit of a conjecture, I guess, but who knows? On some level he knew that I knew. And he had to respond, for whatever the reason was, I don't know. But it was like I said, it was just, I didn't know what he was going to say. I figured he really 9 out of 10 times I would think he would just say, oh, I don't know what you're talking about, buddy. It's what's a lot of people would do that, So it was very interesting. It was very, very, like I said, very, I was very surprised at how he responded,
And what's even more interesting about it, Walt, is that, you had this conversation with him. He doesn't know who you are. He doesn't know who you're connected to. So,
absolutely.
So shortly afterwards, you and I are talking about the conversation, right? So this is how it gets communicated out to the masses, right? So a very simple conversation, which in many situations would go nowhere other than the two people having the conversation, is now going to be disseminated out to a much broader audience. And, in my view, and you and I, both have very strong spiritual understandings.
Yes.
To me, this is the universe's way of ensuring that the truth is published, that it's put out there.
Like a correction.
Right. For those who have ears to hear, eyes to see, you're going to see this, you're going to hear this. To me, that's a big piece of this too. I don't look at that and say, oh, that's kind of weird that he spoke to you, then you spoke to me, and then I have 15,000 subscribers,
Right.
There's a reason why.
True. There is.
Right? There's
Absolutely.
a reason why that path was taken. Yeah.
But, it's funny, getting back a little bit to carrying this burden around. I think Harrison and Lennon had the same thing, that, they were carrying that around with them. And that's why they put all of those clues out there in their songs. And I went back and listened to Harrison's acceptance speech at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, which Paul didn't show up to. I'm not sure why.
Yeah.
But anyway.
Yeah.
Oh, well, Billy, yeah, Billy didn't show up. So Harrison said during the course of the speech that we're just, it's just kind of a segment of the Beatles here. And we know why John's not here. Obviously because he'd been killed. And then he said, we love John and we loved past tense Paul.
Right.
So to me, that was an indication of, if he was talking about the current Paul or Bill, he would have said, we love Paul, present tense.
Right.
So to me, little things like that, where they're just kind of releasing this angst that they've been, or this guilt or whatever you want to call it. Maybe, I don't know whether maybe guilt's a little too strong a word, but maybe not. I don't know. That they feel like they've been part of this big lie, and it is a burden to carry around. It's like if you were impersonating somebody, if Mike Williams was impersonating somebody and you had to constantly be on guard of not letting this little thing out that's going to indicate who you are. Like if you're I don't know, if you've committed a crime or something and you have to always be on guard. That's why they say it's hard to cover up a lie. It's because there's all these little things that you have to be aware of, and you have to be really good at not divulging things. So maybe that's part of the whole thing with Denny too. That it's sort of a release for these people. It's a big burden. I think 50 years to have to not weigh every word you say, kind of pretty much. And, I don't know what they say behind the scenes and everything, but,
Well, it's interesting. You mentioned the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, right? So George also said that, I'm going to paraphrase here, but he had said it's kind of sad that this is what is left.
Yes.
And he was talking about him and
right.
Ringo.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So he was talking about there are only two Beatles left from the original band. And you're right. He did say, and we all loved, past tense, Paul.
Right. And that struck me.
Yeah, that was a clip that I had put together, and I had actually slowed down George's audio so that it was very clear that he was using past tense. Because if you run it at normal speed, you're going to miss it.
Especially if you're just listening to it as just like an acceptance speech that doesn't have any kind of innuendo built into it.
Yeah.
But when you go back and listen to it a couple of times, it's very clear.
It is very clear.
Even at normal speed, it's pretty clear, I think.
The other thing, too, is even though somebody is a Freemason, they're still a human being. It doesn't mean that they don't have emotions.
Oh, no.
It doesn't mean that they don't carry a heaviness, that they don't struggle with certain things, maybe things that they've been involved in or things that they know, but they are sworn to secrecy because of the brotherhood. But, that being sworn to secrecy, that oath, yes, it overrides how perhaps you would actually want to operate, but that doesn't mean internally, that you're not struggling with certain things.
Absolutely. Well, you have emotions. Human beings have emotions, and you have to cope with that. That's what I think. And I really got that sense from him that's what was going on. Above and beyond even the Masonic level. I think on a human level, it was like he was communicating somehow, in some sense. So it was pretty interesting. So that's basically what happened. And, I hope it brings a little more light to the subject. And, it's not a huge revelation, I guess, but it's something, it's like another piece to the puzzle, sort of,
Yeah, and that's what I've been telling folks, Walt, is that one aspect of this, or one piece of the puzzle by itself, may not mean a lot. So, what we're doing is we are building a case based upon circumstantial evidence, not direct evidence, because we weren't in the band, right?
Right. No,
We weren't playing with Billy.
we weren't there.
We weren't there, but it's circumstantial. So when we take your interaction and we combine it with Denny's previous interaction on that interview from a year or two ago, when we listen to Dana Carvey calling him Billy, when we hear Olivia Harrison saying, hello, Billy, and, we start to add all of these pieces together. This in the Martin Scorsese film about George Harrison. Bill comes into the room, George is sitting on a sofa, and George reaches up and says, hello, William. Good to see you again.
I've seen
Something
that,
to that effect.
Yeah,
right? So, this is just not an isolated case. We have many, many instances where these interactions have been recorded. They have been documented. It's just a matter of us putting them all together and then, putting on a cap that says, okay, let's critically think through this.
Right.
And let's be reasonable and use logic. What are we looking at?
Right.
And so, the evidence to me is overwhelming.
Oh, I agree.
Overwhelming.
When you really look at it, if you just if you just take a surface viewpoint, you can say, oh, well, that's just a bunch of stuff that people put together. And like you say, when you put things in isolation, it doesn't seem as important. But when you put it all together, when you string it all together, it makes a trail. Like why would anybody call him William? It's not his middle name. It's, if it wasn't his real name, why would they just randomly call him William or Beatle Bill or whatever the reference is? It just,
exactly.
And like my interaction with Denny, he knew exactly what I was talking about. He knew the Bill I was referring to.
Yes.
But it just, he just kind of let it out gradually, and it was funny. One more thing before we wrap up. I ran across this, and you may be aware of this. There's I think it's a John Grisham book, where he talks about, something that MI6 does. And I don't want to get too deeply into what MI6 is and stuff, but it's an arm of the Tavistock Institute. It's British Secret Service, man.
Right.
I think they were heavily involved in this whole thing because
the British version of the CIA.
Yeah, right, exactly. Tavistock, I think, orchestrated this whole thing. But they have a procedure, according to Grisham anyway. This is in his book. I don't know the title of the book. That's called radical appearance modification. Have you heard of that?
Yes. And
the title of McCartney's second solo album is Ram. But all in capital letters, like you would do that when each letter stood for another word. What's that called? There's a term for that. I forget what it is.
Like an acronym.
Acronym, yes.
Yeah.
So I always thought that was kind of a curious title. Like I said, I was never a huge fan of McCartney's solo work with just him or even with Wings, but I don't know. I just always kind of thought that was a curious title. And if you think about it, there's a lot of levels to that. If that does indeed refer to his, radical appearance modification, or the fact that it's Billy Shears, the shepherd, and that whole thing. So maybe there's a bunch of different levels to that. I don't know. Had you ever heard of that?
I have heard of that. And, somebody had brought that to my attention going back, I guess, about a year ago or so. I don't discount anything. In the work that I've done, Billy was clearly tied into Tavistock. He was clearly tied into British intelligence. He had participated in work with the CIA, especially during the Summer of Love at the Monterey Pop Festival and in the distribution of LSD.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Well, when you think about it, the Beatles were, one of the main proponents of that. I mean, they talked about that,
Well, that's what Sgt. Pepper was all about. Sgt. Pepper was the introduction into the psychedelic era, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
So I don't discount that. In the memoirs of Billy Shears, he says that RAM is an acronym for replacing a McCartney.
Oh, well, there's another one. Yeah.
It doesn't mean that the MI6 acronym does not apply.
Yes.
Right? So it doesn't mean that at all. That's the thing. This is really a case study in how the shadow government or the deep state, whatever you want to call it,
Cabal.
the cabal, yeah, how it operates.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
You know, I've learned so much from this, Walt, to be honest. When I first got into this, I didn't think I would be doing this 2.5 years later. I mean, to the degree that I am.
Yeah, and there's so much to it. It's very convoluted. There's so many layers.
Yeah.
You know, by intention. So.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I am so glad that you contacted me, Walt. It's always wonderful to speak to you, and
I'm glad you gave me the time to come on and talk a little bit about this. And
absolutely.
Again, it's just, it's maybe one small piece, but sometimes a small piece leads to a key to a bigger puzzle.
Yeah. And anytime you want to come on to talk about anything, just let me know, because we have great conversations. And before we got to recording this show, folks, Walt is in the process of writing another book. So we will cover that too, Walt, when you have that finished. Do you have a timeline? Do you have a due date when you think you're going to have the book completed?
I'm hoping to have it done by late spring.
Okay.
And the actual writing, and then you have to have it edited, and then you try to get an agent to represent it. So who knows? But I've dedicated myself to finishing it. Now I've been working on it for quite a while. So I'm hoping that working on it daily will get me to where I want to be more quickly.
And it has to do with the music industry.
It does. It's actually the working title is Blues Club. There again with a club. The club element, being in the club, yes. like Danny's in the club, and that club in a larger
sense. We're not in.
Exactly, yeah. And don't want to be actually. So I hope that it sort of falls in line with the way I think people are, in a larger sense. I think people are waking up, to exactly what you're talking about, and you're one of the people on the forefront of that, and I think shows like Coast to Coast and those kind of shows are starting to get people to a higher degree of awareness and illumination, maybe you could say. We're becoming more aware of things that are just not as they present themselves to be. And I hope that's happening. It's part of why I am on this journey that I'm on to try and talk about this kind of stuff. And,
Yeah, it's a good journey to be on. It's the best journey to be on, because this is really what it's all about, right? It's all about learning as much as you possibly can, learning the truth. That's the thing, right? And then applying that truth to your life, and also enriching your soul.
Exactly.
With that knowledge. Right. That's really what it's all about. But that's probably a discussion for another show.
Well, like you said in your piece, it's ego versus soul development. That's really what it comes down to. And you have to get rid of your ego and get moving in that direction. And you're right, that is another show. But so anyway, thanks for having me on today, Mike. I appreciate it. I think it was
very welcome.
Conversation. I hope people enjoy it and see what happens.
Okay, and I'll catch up with you on Facebook. And thank you so much again for coming on.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Take it easy.
Bye-bye, Walt.
Enjoy your weekend.
You too. And that concludes another Sage or Quay interview, and I hope you enjoyed the discussion as much as I did. Links to my guests' websites and social media are listed in the description box below. And as always, I would like to thank everyone for listening and visiting the blog. You can find all my social media and web links by visiting my hub website at sageofquay.com. Also, if you get a moment, please visit laboroflovemusic.com to check out my music and album releases. And remember, live in truth and always serve creation. It's really that simple. See everyone with the next show. Be safe, enjoy, and God bless.